I began the previous sermon by pointing out that it takes work to get close to what Jesus taught. This parable exemplifies how later generations hijacked Jesus' thought, thus dulling his sword into a spade. Well, we can make use of that spade, and perhaps a torch as well, and dig ourselves out of the mess created by both the gospel writers and our interpretive tradition. Well before Matthew got his hands on it, this parable of the talents had been modified beyond what Jesus said. By using our spade, we can dig into current scholarship and we may find the point of origin. Let's look again at a timeline. Paul wrote his letters mostly during the 50s. Paul's visionary call led him to think on the imminent arrival of God's new creation. Even though Paul slowly gave up on that aspect of his vision, others seem to have latched onto it. So it seems that a collector of sayings of Jesus, also writing during the 50s, filtered those sayings through an apocalyptic lens. That led to a fog of nonsense that blurs our view of Jesus' teachings. Since at least 3 of the New Testament gospel writers inherited these sayings through a document scholars call Q, they saw Jesus through that fog. In addition, Matthew added his own interpretation to this parable by adding the last verse. So, as a first step, let's take our torch and burn verse 30 from red to black. Now, taking our cue from the understanding that Jesus was not an apocalyptic preacher, we can blacken all those elements that reflect an end-of-time theme. Finally, Jesus did not interpret his parables. He simply spoke them and let others decide how to understand them in the context of their lives. His parables tended to be short and shockingly to the point. So we can do a controlled burn to remove excess verbiage. After all that, I come up with this. You know, God's imperial rule is as if a man called together 3 of his slaves and gave them money in trust. To the first he gave 5 talents, to the second 2 talents, and to the third 1. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went out and put the money to work. He doubled his investment. The second also doubled his money. But the third went and dug a hole and hid his master's talent. When the master settled accounts with the slaves, the first reported, "Master, you handed me 5 talents. As you can see, I have made you another 5. The second likewise reported, "Master, you handed me 2 talents. As you can see, I have made you another 2. The third slave reported, "Sir, I know that you drive a hard bargain, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you didn't scatter. So I went and buried your money in the ground. Look, here it is." Now, let's put this parable into the context of Jesus' life. The 2 defining elements of Jesus' life were, 1, he was a person in the Hebraic tradition, and 2, he lived under Roman rule. Like many of his people, Jesus did not like living under Roman rule. Unlike some others, he thought armed resistance was futile. So Jesus modeled non-violent resistance. This parable, as I've reconstructed it, shows one way to do just that. Let's take a closer look. First, a comment about this phrase that I use, God's imperial rule. I use it as a substitute for the phrase kingdom of God. Aside from being more inclusive, the phrase reflects the importance of that second defining element in Jesus' life. For him, God's imperial rule was the exact opposite of Roman imperial rule. Roman rule was based on raw power enforced by a strong military. It secured, or tried to anyway, peace through power. Jesus viewed God's imperial rule as a set of values one could activate in one's life. Values that enabled positive, wholesome, and loving relationships among all humanity. In this little story, Jesus shows one person doing just that. The man in this parable is an absentee landlord. We learn that when the third slave says, "Sir, I know that you drive a hard bargain, reaping where you didn't sow and gathering where you didn't scatter." Absentee landlords were a major problem in Jesus' environment, and they were really nasty people. Their hard bargains drove peasant farmers into tenancy and even slavery. These powerful men had the full force of Roman imperialism behind them, including the power of taxation. If a farmer didn't want to sell, these rich people could simply tax the person into slavery and acquire the land. The size of that man's wealth is enormous. One talent, like the one given to the third slave, equaled about 20 years' wages for the average worker. That's essentially a lifetime income, assuming that one managed to live to about 40. We inherited through our interpretive tradition the idea that the first two slaves were the thrifty sort, who honed their investment skills and generate wealth. This is exactly what the modifiers of the parable want us to think. That's because they intended to make Jesus appealing to the larger Roman world. Something they did very well, actually. Jesus, however, viewed the situation differently. His experience told him that wealth is generated by those who do work and produce goods. Those who get very rich do so because they cheat, manipulate the system, and just plain steal from others. The rich man's hard bargain is a case in point. While he got his wealth legally, he did not get it ethically. Jesus concerned himself with morality in human relations. In this context, then, Jesus' original hearers would have understood the first two slaves as doing exactly what the rich man had done to build their wealth. Jesus' audience saw them as the bad guys. The third slave is the hero. He refused to play the game. He simply gave back exactly what he had been given. Put another way, he refused to play by the rules that harmed other people. Jesus ended the parable with that challenging phrase, "Look, here it is." And you can almost hear a sort of "Have a nice day" floating in the background. And his audience probably cheered, for they were people cheated out of their wealth by an immoral system. The Jesus who spoke this parable would march with those protesting racial injustice. He would cheer the bravery of women bringing sexual abuse to public attention. And he would probably be very interested in concepts such as employee-owned businesses. In short, Jesus would call his followers peacefully, but not passively, to seek justice in the face of power.